Welcome back. Right, not very far from here, just across the Med, there is a strip of land, desert to be precise, that runs from Morocco, here, and the Atlas Mountains, all the way across Africa to Egypt and Sudan in the east. The landmass is larger than that of continental United States. But what do we actually know about this stretch of land and its history? Well, to find out a little bit more, we're going to speak to the author of a new book, The Sahara, Eamonn Gearon. Good morning and welcome to Talk Radio Europe. How are you, Eamonn?
I'm very well, Steve. Good morning to you too.
Well, as you probably have guessed there, if you didn't already know, I'm speaking to you from Marbella, and if I go maybe 50 kilometres west of here, I get to the beautiful town of Tarifa, where I actually looks as if I could stretch my hand out and touch Morocco. Is that crystal clear? I think it's about 9 miles away. And then from down there we have the Sahara. And as I said, it's something that we all talk about, we all know about, but we don't know that much about, really. Most people, do we?
I think that's fairly true to say, Steve. It was remarkable when I came to write this book that there were no competing volumes out there which deal with the culture and history of the Sahara in a single volume. And as you mentioned, it's larger than the entire United States of America, and yet it's only home, the Sahara proper, to just 3 million people.
And that's surely because it's just quite uninhabitable.
Exactly. But those patches where we do have the water of the oases have a very rich history, and before it was desert, it was land. There were forests in the Sahara, there were elephants in the Sahara, there were, even before it was land, there was an ocean in the eastern part of the desert, and we have the remains of whale bones in the Egyptian Sahara.
No.
So quite a distinguished history.
Now, this is this kind of stuff, you're now touching on the kind of stuff that I love, because we're going back now in thousands of years to where our history is not that great. And for me personally, I think, Eamonn, history is a little bit made up. And what we're starting to now find goes against the grain of some of the history that we have in some of these places. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much history there. It's very difficult often to disentangle. And there's the human history, as I say, but then there's the prehistory, and that's where things get very complicated.
Yeah.
I'm sure many of your listeners have seen such great movies as The English Patient, which I deal with in the book. I've got a nice chapter on film set in the Sahara. But there we remember the great cave paintings, which clearly show that people were living in what are now uninhabitable spaces for thousands of years, and they recorded their lives and their hunting and everything else. And that's all we have now to know them by, is the artwork they left behind.
Well, let's have a look at some of the history here. I mean, you said they found whale bones. How old are those whale bones?
Well, the whale bones, they're sort of a proto-whale, the whales before there were whales, and we are talking about millions of years ago, when great swathes of the Sahara, before the Mediterranean existed, there was an enormous ocean that covered North Africa and what we think of as Saudi Arabia today, and went off towards where we find the Himalayas. And this enormous ocean, called the Tethys Ocean, as I say, was there before we had the continent of Europe was formed properly, certainly before the Straits of Gibraltar opened up. And as the seas receded, these whales were left behind, as it were.
Now, understand, and again, the further history, and I know this is slightly off area, but you used to be able to walk from Gibraltar to Africa, didn't you, at one time?
Indeed, yes, absolutely.
And that's, is that why, because Gibraltar has the salt caves, but masses of salt down there, and that's something to do with a previous ocean that was there, is that correct?
That's right, and in fact, in the northern Sahara in Tunisia, there is an area called the Chott El Djerid, which is the largest area of salt plains in the world, and it's quite amazing. You can drive over parts of it when it's a bit hard, and it looks like you're floating. There are a couple of tracks that run through it, and you're driving across the sheer white sheet of sand, of salt, I beg your pardon, that goes on for miles and miles and miles. And when it shimmers in the sun, it's one of the most amazing sights on Earth.
I was just going to say, apart from being blinding with the sun, it must be really, it must be quite spectacular as well.
Even more blinding than a day on the beach. Yeah,
yeah, I would imagine. Now, the history though it's one of conquered and cursed, and it really is a a fascinating history for the Sahara, isn't it?
It is, and I think that because so few people live in the desert itself today, we overlook it sometimes, and we think it's just a load of sand dunes. Well, it's a great deal more than sand dunes, and as you hinted at, history is one of conquest after conquest. The Romans took the Sahara, the Persians were there, the Phoenicians before them, and then, of course, coming up to the much more modern times, it has a very important place in the First and Second World War. That's something which is recent history, which people, have family members who fought in the desert, Rommel against Montgomery, the Desert Rats, so that the history is not going away. And I suppose what's most exciting for me about the book coming out now is that all of these places I've lived in and written about, they're in the news very much now. Libya, particularly with the revolution going on there, the uprisings in Algeria. I was in Egypt earlier this year reporting on the revolution there. So, the history is not just something of the past. It informs where we are today.
Now, what about its natural minerals? Is there oil there?
There's a great deal of oil and gas in bits of the desert. Mm-hmm. Algeria has, I think, the second highest concentration of natural gas in the world. Libya supplies a great deal of oil and gas to Europe primarily, although a little bit to America. It's a very pure form of oil. And the oil and gas deposits that we find in the Sahara are evidence of just how dense the forests once were in that part of the world. Because as they broke down and collapsed, it's these carbon deposits that leave us the precious oil and gas that we need so badly today.
Now, one of my favourite facts that you write about in the book is that this was, and interestingly enough, it looks, that they're delving back in there again, or never seem to have got themselves out of there, really. This stretch of land is where the US Marines had their first foreign engagement in 1805.
Isn't that remarkable? And here we are again today. Well, not US later. Marines on the ground, but 200 years later.
And they're still hanging around, yeah.
They're still hanging around. It's funny, yeah. It was in 1805, the first time that American soldiers were engaged in any sort of combat overseas, and that was in Libya. And the US Marine hymn, you might have heard them singing from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. It goes way back to 1805.
It comes from that. Right, okay.
In fact, the first country to recognise the independence of the United States was Morocco. So there's another sort of Saharan link for us.
I'm going to take a note of that one because that was something I didn't know. The first country to recognise the independence of the US was Morocco.
I know, it's remarkable, isn't it? And they did this partly because there was trouble at the time with the Barbary pirates, the Corsairs. And America struck a deal with Morocco to recognise each other's authority, if you like. And it meant then that there were no American prisoners taken as slaves when the Moroccan ships were raiding Christian ships at the time. The Americans were protected by this recognition by the Sultan of Morocco.
Now, because of its geographical makeup or natural conditions, mm-hmm. is there still an awful lot about the Sahara that we are still to unearth?
Yes, there is. As remarkable as things like the pyramids are in Egypt, it's reckoned that whatever we've dug up in that single country, there's a lot more still under the sand. There are rumours of buried cities. I mean, I'm not suggesting people just run off there with a metal detector because it's a very big area.
No, Eamonn, did you see the programme, the Bank Holiday Monday on BBC, about the satellite archaeology that was going on?
I did indeed, yeah, fascinating. I mean, that's exactly what you're talking about now. There's so much down there. I mean, just 5 years ago, a team of archaeologists working in Niger, which is the country just to the south of Libya and Algeria, they dug up an old city with hundreds of graves, undisturbed, in the middle of nowhere, seemingly. But, there's evidence there of a very major civilization that we're just now coming to understand. So we are lifetimes and lifetimes away from unwrapping all the mysteries of the Great Desert.
And through that unravelling, hopefully we can start to get a grip of our ancient history, which I still believe we have a huge question mark over.
Many question marks, yes, and I fear that we may not ever have answers to all of our questions, but I think the discovery and the questioning is part of the fun. It's part of what makes us human, I suppose, isn't it? Always be questing, to be asking questions.
It is, but the research that you've done, Eamonn, does it not make you more intrigued as to these cities that are under the sand, that, how far back do we as humans really go? And how civilized were we really? Because things seem to be changing all the time.
You mean in terms of the dates?
Yes.
Yes, indeed. Certainly we have evidence of fire in the Sahara that dates back tens of thousands of years. There were smallish civilizations there tens of thousands of years ago. The rock art we find goes back over 12,000 years in the Sahara. In terms of civilization, once people start having a language and creating art and jewelry and clothing and being able to cook food, I think those are some of the things that mark us aside from non-human species, shall we say. Our advancement hasn't got that far in some senses. When you dig up items of jewelry like bead necklaces and you see the same things being sold today, not just in Africa but in Europe as well, the same things we use to adorn ourselves, basically the same method of clothing, it's remarkable how little some things have changed.
Certainly is. Now, you need to have a word with your publicist because my copy of this book hasn't arrived yet. And
really? I'm very sorry.
No, but this is my type of reading. It really is. It just seems absolutely fascinating. The book is called The Sahara, A Cultural History, and it delves... How far back does it go?
Well, we go back millions of years in 80,000 words or less. There's a great deal in there. It's packed in, but we do our best. And first reports are very favourable, I'm pleased to say.
Okay, well, listen, congratulations on it. It does look fascinating, and it's one that I really am looking forward to having a read of. Eamonn Gearon, thank you very much for joining me this morning and having a chat with us. Once again, the book, The Sahara, A Cultural History. Thanks a lot, Eamonn.
Thanks very much, Steve. Bye.
Take care, bye-bye.